Besides adding such a text form field, I also want to add a row thereafter. A row which allows me to display two other widgets next to each other horizontally. And the two widgets I want to display here are another text form field, which can be used to enter the quantity of items that should be added. And next to that, though we will of course configure this in a second, but next to that, I want to have a drop-down button which can be used for choosing a category. And here we don't want to use the regular drop-down button, but instead we want to use the drop-down button form field here, which again is the form-specific version of this drop-down button widget that adds extra form-specific features or supports those form-specific features. Now, besides adding some new features, it still works as the old drop-down button though, as you can already see. It wants some items here and an onChanged method, which will be triggered whenever a new item was picked. But still, this is how you can add this drop-down button form field. And I'll also add one more widget in this row. Between these two widgets, I'll add a sized box for some extra spacing. So here I'll then add a width of 8. Now for the configuration of these widgets, I'll start with the text form field, and here I'll set the decoration parameter to an input decoration object that allows me to add the label to this widget here, a text widget as a label where I say quantity, because that is in the end the label I want to add, and that is my input decoration therefore. That's all I want to add. And I will also set an initial value here, which is another special parameter I can add on this text form field, which is not available on the regular text field, which allows me to set an initial value that will be displayed in this text form field. And here we could, for example, set this to 1 as a value. Very important, not as a number, but as a string, because text form field, like text field, in the end works with strings. Every user input is a string, even if it's a number, but it is a number as a string then, and the initial value therefore also must be a string. In this case, the string 1. So that's the basic text form field configuration I want to use here. Now for the drop-down button form field, I of course want to output my categories here as items, and therefore here I'll add a list. And in this list, I'll use this for loop, this in-list for loop, which you saw a couple of times already. And we can then use this for loop to go through all the categories, like this. And for categories to be available here, we must import categories from the categories.dart file. With that imported, we can use it, but we don't use it entirely like this. Instead, categories, if you take a look at it, is actually a map, not a list. And we can't loop through a map like this. Thankfully, it's quite easy to convert it to a list though, by using the special entries property that is available on all Dart maps. So this is a property provided by Dart on every map, and entries gives you an iterable, which in the end contains all your map key value pairs as items in that iterable, so in that list in the end. So here we can loop through all our category entries then, and we get these entry item objects then. And for every category in categories.entries, we can then output a drop-down menu item. So this does not change. There is no form-specific version of this widget. It's still drop-down menu item, which wants a child widget. And the child here, in my case here, will be a row for every drop-down menu item, because I want to have two items next to each other here. And here in that row, I want to have a container, which again will be a box with the color of the category that's being displayed here. Then next to that, a sized box for some spacing, here with a width of 6, for example. And then a text widget. Now in the text widget, I want to output the title of the category. And this can be done by using this category here, which we're getting from category entries. And then there we'll have a key and a value property, because again, we're operating on those entry items yielded by the entries method in this list of entries. Now every entry item will have a key value that in the end gives us the key we had for that item in the map, and the value which, as you might guess, is the value for that key in the map. And here I'm interested in the value and then there the title. Now in my container here, I'll give this container a width of 16 and a height of 16 to render such a square, and then add the color, which here will be category.value.color. And these should all be children of this row. So we should move all these widgets into the children list of the row like this. And that should then display fitting drop-down menu items. Now, as you also might recall from earlier in the course, you can and typically also should define which value will be assigned to every drop-down menu item. So the value that will then be available in the onChanged function here later whenever the user picks a different drop-down menu item. And for that you can add the value parameter to the drop-down menu item widget. And here my value should be the overall category value object, which is that object with the color and title property. We could also use category key to use the enum value here. But here I'll simplify things a little bit and use the overall value object as a value, which is something you can do and which I'm doing here. Now we also must add a function, and we'll add the actual function logic later. For the moment it will just be an empty anonymous function that is called automatically by Flutter every time the user picks a different item, and which will automatically receive that item's value as an input. So in this case, the category that was selected. And that's the finished drop-down button in its form-specific variant. If you re-render everything, you should be able to see this, but here we actually don't. We don't see anything here because if you take a look at the debug console, we got an error, and in the end it's a rendering error because we're doing something which you already learned earlier, that it won't work. We're in the end using a text field inside of a row. And I mentioned earlier in the course that text field in the end also is unconstrained horizontally, as is the row, and that's why we're getting an error here. To work around this, you should wrap text form field with the expanded widget like this. And you should also do this for the drop-down button, because for that widget it's actually the same. So here we should also wrap expanded around the drop-down button form field widget like this. And if you do that, if you do add expanded around these two widgets, and you then save everything and restart, you should be able to go there and see those widgets. Now, to make sure that they are also aligned correctly, I'll then also go to my row and there add the cross-axis alignment, and here set this to cross-axis alignment end. Now with that, we can see that this is aligned properly, and you will also see that indeed if you do choose a value in the dropdown, it is displayed here, and you might recall that for the expense tracker with the regular dropdown button, this was not the case. So with this drop-down button in its form-specific version, indeed we now do have that extra functionality of our selected item being stored, and that is another feature provided by that form. But of course we still had no item initially, but that is something we'll take care of later. We do have these basic inputs though, and with all these inputs added, we can next add the buttons before we then thereafter take a closer look at those form-specific features and functionalities that we may now use.